We aren't live yet, but we will be in a moment. It's
Well,
preparing. And I'll cut out some of this stuff, so we'll just, when the live starts, that's what all I'll put up.
yeah.
Okay, so we're live now.
Hello, hello world.
So what I'm going to do is I'll monitor the chat, to see
Okay,
if people start asking questions and whatnot.
okay.
Yep. So we'll see who kind of jumps in. Says there's one person in already, but I don't see anyone yet.
It might be me.
Yeah, perhaps. So I'm going to put this here so I can kind of see what goes down with it.
So,
Yeah, this
Is Wormy going to do a podcast with Peretti?
yeah, it's something they had talked about doing. You'll see
Peretti,
the YouTube
I,
screen's kind of a little bit behind what we're saying, but that's all right. But yeah,
okay,
Wormy's
yeah,
gonna do a podcast.
that'd be good. Since we're recording, uh, I would look forward to that because, like I'm a Peretti, um, I'm a Peretti fan. I don't think that the guy should be forgotten. Um, and we talked to him together a couple of times, and he's a bit of a rough personality because he's kind of, you know what I mean. But
Yeah,
it's like I think that shouldn't matter really. The fact of the matter is he hasn't mellowed with age. So it's cool if he's going to be edgy and stuff. The only problem I would see is that he doesn't follow the sport anymore. So he's not like watching like the new guys and stuff like that. And I can understand why, not caring, but um, that would help them on a new podcast. I wonder if Wormy does follow that still, if he watches like the modern shows.
he does. I don't think he does, but he actually have mentioned on the thing that uh, some people in Puerto Rico have been reaching out to him about possibly starting a promotion there.
Hmm.
So that could be pretty interesting.
Yeah, like I said, you get back to me when you've done 50 shows, or 30 shows or something. These guys with an idea for a new promotion, and again, not for nothing, but is there like a superstar in Puerto Rico? Like who's like what is it just going to be a grassroots promotion?
Grassroots, yeah.
That's a tall order, and the economy there isn't all that huge that they're going to be doing major shows in a little while. So we'll see. I don't have a lot of faith in somebody starting from scratch nowadays.
Yeah, but if it's just Puerto Rico, it may not be, an issue.
Yeah, yeah. Again, who are going to be your local ticket sellers?
Who
And
knows?
at what level are they going to be fighting? Because you know, at some point, one of the things that the UFC's done is with kind of purifying the sport to the point where everybody looks the same and this, that, and the other stuff is. But and there are parts of the sport that are watered down, but you also see a certain level all the time. You know what I mean? You don't see like the two skinny dummies that knocked each other out, like from video 15 years ago. Remember?
Hmm.
So yeah, it's you in Costa Rica. We did a few shows, and I remember vividly, and it was kind of like one of those things where I was like, man, what am I doing? Um, these guys showed up. It was in Jaco, which is a tourist town. These American guys showed up coming to see the show, and the opening fighters were just simply kind of amateurish, not impressive guys, and they walked out. You know, so yeah, that eye test, everybody has to look like a fighter and stuff like that. When you're starting from scratch at a local grassroots show, even that could be a problem.
Right. But, it'd be good to see him get back into it.
Yeah, no, I mean, like like and Dana likes to say, another guy who wants to lose his money, you know. So yeah,
I was telling him he should hire you to matchmake.
uh, my Rolodex is kind of old. So I don't know how many modern contacts I have. I Some people would still react and send fighters and stuff like that. But what I don't want to do is shit like GFL either, where it's like all of a sudden, my guys from 10 years ago are going to get back in the ring or do whatever. Like I don't think that does anybody any good, you know.
Right. Hold on a
So
second.
yeah,
I'm putting out that we're live here, so
okay.
let people know.
Is the UFC doing a New Year's show? I haven't even checked.
No.
Or are they doing nothing this weekend? Like I guess it's a few days before New Year's. Let's go to old Sherdog.
Old reliable.
Yeah, I'm used to it. Like a lot of people use other sites nowadays and stuff. They may not even be the biggest one anymore, but I mean I'm used to Sherdog. I like the layout and I their database I think is a little smoother than the Topology database. Although Topology sometimes does have like cancel fights and more information.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, at the end of this, yeah, it's another one of those things I think about. Back in the old hook and shoot days, I did a database on in Access, but I had a much better database than any of these clowns. You know what I mean? Then I stopped entering data into it and stuff like that. But um, yeah, somebody could have bought that from me, and maybe things would be different. But I
Yeah.
guess closing deals is my problem.
All
So
right. So
what are
going
we up
back
to?
in. Hmm?
I'm looking here. So UFC 313 is going to be so. And Tyson Fury fought Usyk again, and that was also in Saudi Arabia. Um, so he's still hell bent on doing stuff like that. But I don't think that Saudi Arabia is going to last too long at the top of the game. I mean, they have all the money in the world. They could if they wanted to, but like I said, I don't have a lot of faith in that. And I think at some point, um, what's this? PFL exceeded Pitbull Frere's contractual obligations. Let's read about PFL fucking ups. Another
Oh,
one of
here's.
those guys.
So Hamza's here. He asked a lot of questions last week, so he can.
I'll do. Okay, I'll
We
do the
got
best I
Miguel
can.
here, Hamza. I know you had some questions you were wanting to ask him.
There's Hamza. Yes, I know him from the definitely from comments on some of our other stuff. Good to have you, brother.
And if you want to do some super chats, that'd be cool too.
Okay. I haven't actually found where the live feed is yet. I'm on your page, but
You
I
don't.
haven't.
You
Oh,
don't
I
have
see.
to unless you want to watch it. You can, but Hamza, if you got some questions, fire away.
Cool. I see.
We're here to
I'm gonna give
share.
myself a like. Yeah. Okay.
I'm just watching the Zoom feed actually, and then I watch the chats on my phone.
Yes, I gave us a
Yeah,
thumbs up, so I'm already contributing here
yeah,
majorly.
we're already there.
Cool. People are doing the uh, fireworks crap still. Drives my dogs crazy. So it's up to three people watching. That's good. Let's see who else
Yeah,
we got here.
we'll get them going. Be all good. I'm putting it out to different places so it can kind of get some people check it out.
He's asking a question about Coker selling Strikeforce.
What was that?
Is he Hamza Mir? Why did Scott sell Strikeforce to the UFC when they were profiting? Um, without any insider knowledge or anything like that, um, like I've met Coker. I talked to him. If you look at some of the history, when once I left Bodog, Bodog actually sponsored a few Strikeforce shows. And by the sponsoring, I mean that they did the logo on the corner kind of thing and things like that. If I'm not mistaken, I think the last show I match made was the show that was at the Playboy Mansion. And you can see that it was a co-match made. There were a couple of fights on there I didn't do. Um, but yeah, you know, profitable. Not like the UFC, they weren't profitable, and I question Coker's love for the sport. I mean, obviously he's been a lifer and stayed in it and done his thing with it. But I think he came from a kickboxing world, and a lot of the guys that he relied on when he was at the top were guys like, um, from the San Jose area and the California area where he was from. So I don't feel he was super active in expanding and going after the UFC. I'm not surprised that they sold to him. The UFC was gobbling everybody up at that point anyway. So yeah, if you can't compete, take your money and run, I guess. And I mean, he went over to Bellator, became an executive there, and cashed checks for a dozen years afterwards, right? So my old partner Mike Davis used to have a theory that he was actually on the UFC's payroll for a long time, so that could be actually why. If Mike's conspiracy theory is correct, then that could be also why he sold Strike Forces, that he was secretly, um, you know, working for the UFC as well. So this is a kind of, just a off the cuff theory, but some of his behavior would lead you to believe, like for example, just your question, Hamza, why would he sell? Yeah, there was definitely times where there was some questionable behavior, and makes you wonder what was going on behind the scenes. Yeah, no, and you're right. They had some assets. They had heavyweights. That's a uh, see, the thing about that though is you have to look at it and you have to think about how sustainable that was. And again, that involves having a big roster and recycling like the UFC does, so that like for example, one of the big heavyweights they had was Josh Barnett. And really, Barnett stopped fighting. And how would they have replaced an asset like that? They probably wouldn't have. They probably would have just continued doing what they did. But at the end of the day, they were doing 75-year-old Ken Shamrock matches and stuff like that. With Bellator, that's what Scott deteriorated to. So if you would have bought that to Strike Force, I don't think there's sustainability. The other thing is think that the CBS shows, that the shows that were on the big channels, the terrestrial channels, for lack of a better word, in the US, they didn't last. So I think CBS may have jumped in, gotten. When you say 4 or 5 million, was that the Kimbo stuff? Um, like I said, those you don't see Channel 4 in New York, which is I think CBS, or Channel 7, I think is CBS in New York. You don't see them broadcasting fights anymore. Even UFC, even the biggest UFC shows. Um, so I think that those types of things were kind of flash in the pans. I think that is what Scott was good at, is making something happen that gets you some attention right away, but then the ability to follow up and just be like I think that's what makes me most impressed by the UFC's machine is and you've probably heard me talk about it, right? the week after uh 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 Forrest and what's the kid's name who died? The big
Oh, Stephen Bonner.
Yes, for the week after Bonner and Forrest Griffin, they had Couture and uh Randy Couture versus Chuck Liddell. I think the rematch. And then within the next month after that, they had Shamrock versus Ortiz. And that's what poker never has ever been able to really do is they do a big thing and then they proceed to hand you average stuff and that's been a lot of their shows. 5 million for Hendo versus Shields. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Shields is a perfect example of a guy from California that I think, you know, Poker may have even known his dad and they were friends and that's what his roster was built on. Henderson was a guy. Journeyman's not the right word, but Henderson's a guy who logs dozens and dozens of fights, so he was going to be there for a while. But again, so you do 5 million with Henderson and Shields. How about the next week? What were you doing the next week? Or did you take 3 months off? Because that's kind of being poker cycle is he's not on the business end wasn't being pushy the way I feel like Dana was. Whereas at this point, you can see UFC on multiple channels around the world, multiple outlets, and it's an every single week show. And anytime that you're going to take a month off, like Bellator would literally, once he got to Bellator and Strikeforce, look at Strikeforce's history of their fights. I mean, I don't think Strikeforce had 50 shows, and that's the problem is if you're going to be a every once in a while show, it will show for sure. Um, you think they would have gotten Cormier? You're right. I think actually that's a good point, Hamza, because Cormier out there with um Poker clearly had a relationship with the um
AKA.
uh, yeah, AKA Javier Mendez, I think his name is. I don't want to get it wrong, but Javier and
Yeah.
those guys worked with him. I think they also had a business guy on that was involved with them, a money guy. I'm not going to remember his name, but Poker clearly had people like that in his circle. But again, you've got to go beyond that stuff. And like I mentioned, yeah, Overeem versus Rogers, you know, they got lucky with that one. To me, Brett Rogers wasn't a marquee name that big, So yeah, and why were they not? Fedor versus Rogers was 8.4 million. Um, yeah, yeah. So it makes you wonder why Dana always said Fedor wasn't a big draw or a big star if he did pulled 8.4 million on CBS. But yeah, so but that's what I mean is so Scott to me had a limited Rolodex. He didn't have the ability to pull, or didn't have not the ability, but didn't have the passion to pull, um, a completely international roster the way it needed to be done. If you look at my record, if you look at the Bodog guys, I made concerted effort, even when I was with Dan Lambert in Florida, I made a concerted effort to bring in guys from Europe. And I had my friends, and I remember Marco, who's with ADCC now, bringing me Joaquin Hansen to my show. Um, and I used these guys a lot. And in one show, I had another team from Norway, and he came up to me. He's like, "Why are those guys here?" I was like, "Because you can't just have one team from a place and be satisfied. You've got to check up and see where the level is of the guys." I think the other kid that fought was another kid named Joaquin. I forget what his last name. Emberg, Joaquin Emberg, if you want to look it up. He was damn good also. He was damn good also. But that's that again. That's the part of Strike Force that I was at least trying to get to as many shows as possible and have a large roster. And I don't think Strike Force or Bellator ever really achieved that. I think they were satisfied with the level they got. You're right. They did big shows. Um, yeah, the M1 stuff. Monty Cox, I think, got a $500,000 a year salary for that from M1 to be their matchmaker and uh their representative in the US kind of stuff. I dealt with those guys a little bit, and there's some people that I'd stay away from. Monty, it was important for him to get his salary and take money, and maybe I should have thought more about that myself. But what I worry, you worry about some ethics there, and those guys there did things their own way. I wouldn't have treated. I felt from the beginning. M1 did maybe 100 and something shows also, but I'm not a huge fan of dealing with people who are not going to look at this completely as a sport. So yeah, I think you're dealing with people that had a limited vision, not the UFC's vision there, and that's at the end of the day why we're all on the scrap heap, and none of us is running shows anymore. Scott's, and I'll say this: Scott's resume and his legacy in the sport um is definitely deeper and bigger than mine. Even though I sometimes can seem arrogant or talking about what I did or hyping what I did. Obviously, he did a lot more than I did, but I think at the very core of it, he started with a limited vision. If you don't have the complete vision that Lena had of going forward and making it a worldwide sport and putting it on TV and making sure you had outlets every week. And now you have a roster. They every once in a while they'll be like, "Well, we're taking our roster from 700 down to 550," and they get rid of 150 guys. It hasn't happened in a while, but they do that. No other companies even come close to that big. So that's just my opinion.
Sorry.
Yeah, that rings tournament where who was it that won it? Was it Henderson that won that one? Um, there's a couple of people jumping on here, so that's cool. Yeah, Jeremy Horn was in that tournament. Randy Couture was in that tournament. They Renzo Gracie beat uh Maurice Smith. I mean, they legitimately had big fights, but like those Japanese companies, Rings, Pancrase, and Shudo, I think they came from pro wrestling company where they all had like a generation before them. Even Paul Gotch was involved in that in bringing those guys up. So when like Maeda considered himself the purist, the Shudo guys clearly considered themselves the purist. Funaki and the guys that founded Pancrase also considered them, and they decided to tear each other apart and not work together. Never work together. Prevented their fighters from fighting on each other's shows, and that becomes a problem. Maeda was the most controversial of all those guys. If I had to pinpoint a moment, Maeda got into an altercation where he beat up Matoki in an airport. And that may actually be very close to the end of his career, where he kind of shot himself in the foot. Um, you know, hitting a woman is not a good look. You know what I mean? And Maeda after that, and then the other thing about rings is they went with uh, less than MMA fighting rules. So when you can't close fist punch in certain positions and stuff, it does get the reputation of being watered down. Um, the rope escapes also are not exactly um something that lends itself. You look less and less like a real fight. The UFC's got to be less and less. It's not what it was UFC two, but um, at the end of the day, they can still say they're the closest thing to a fight. And Rings and Pancrase eventually switched to doing those types of rules, but Rings kind of started out with these kind of hybrid rules, bizarre rules, and things. And um, yeah, but they are a landmark organization. I still, you know, if I could dig up my old VHS tapes, I would still watch some of those fights. There was some classic stuff in Rings.
Sometimes I wish Japanese MMA could get maybe more consolidated to maybe a couple of shows rather than several.
Yeah, no, Hamza, you're right. I Shudo started in the '80s, and that's because um, I think if you look back at it, like their first generation of guys, like oh, you're gonna catch me on some names, but legitimately, one of their founders was Tiger Mask, and Tiger Mask could really fight too.
Satoru
Um,
Sayama.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And then who was uh who was the chairman, the guy who was the leader? He owned a coffee shop. And they also had they had
Well, Sakamoto was in charge.
yeah, Sakamoto, that's the guy. Yeah,
Yeah.
Sakamoto is the guy who owns the coffee shop. And that's the problem too, is that they were the least funded of the shows. Less money than Pancrase. Pancrase was backed up by a rich guy who owns Don Quixote. And I think Todd will back me up that Don Quixote is kind of like a Japanese version of Walmart, for lack of a better word, like an all-purpose store.
Hmm.
And he would give them, 7-figure budgets for a year. And Shudo never had that. To me, Shudo is clearly the best one of those organization that Japan ever had. But I think they were also the smallest and also the hardest to work with. I can give you a story of I was Shudo's one of Shudo's first representatives, along with uh, we just interviewed him, the promoter from Hawaii, Todd.
Oh, TJ.
Yeah, TJ. So TJ did his thing there. I was doing our thing in Indiana. If you look at it, we had many Shudo fighters come to Indiana to fight, and I was one of their first representatives there. And they stopped working with me, and they went to Rich Santoro, and Rich was a good guy. Rich kind of went off and had a family and left the sport kind of thing. Um, but Rich also sucked in Ironheart Crown. He was a Chicago guy, so Judo kind of had that moment where they had a couple of organizations. So why'd they stop working with me? Okay, here's my story. They may have another angle on it. I can be tough to deal with when you give me nonsense, and they have Shudo A class, Shudo B class, Shudo C class, and at that point, I think look at Shudo had the best 125-pound guys in the world: Matt Hamilton, Jeremy Bolt, Chaku Murata. The list goes on and on. I think it was a fight between Murata and Jeremy Bolt that I wanted to get 3 rounds out of, which means that you got to be Shudo A class. And we signed the contract for a 3-round fight. I sent the list into Shudo, and they came back to me and said, "We think this fight's a B class fight." So now they put me in a situation where I got to go back to fighters and go, you were A class, but now we're going to make you B class. And really, that's not a conversation you want to have with guys, uh, in any way, shape, or form. Also, it's going to be a 2-round fight, not a 3-round fight. Change the contract, maybe change the pay, et cetera, et cetera. So I told Kudo, look, we can't have this. What you need to do now is you need to send me the exact criteria for what is A and why is this a B class fight, so that I never make this mistake again. And they couldn't do it because it's just at that point they consider themselves like the experts, and it's a subjective move. They had no real rules for that. And they put me in a bad situation, so I freaking didn't like it. And that's one of the reasons why I stopped working with Shudo. So even them, who I consider the most pure and best organization, sometimes let egos get in the way, and it wasn't a sport. And you really have to take the egos out of it. Dana obviously is just an ego driven machine, but at some point with the commissions, they have another entity there kind of managing it in some way, shape, or form. And the UFC is not really a sport, not with their championship rankings and that sort of stuff, all very subjective. I'd be against all that. There's no way that, uh, you know, Frankie Edgar would not have fought for the title so that I can get Conor McGregor in there. Not on my damn watch. That wouldn't have happened. So yeah, it's that's been the bugaboo of all the companies is at some point People get too big for their britches and they have an ego. I'm not saying I don't have an ego, but my ego was that this is pure sport and let's deal with it that way. Are you Hamza? Are you when you say Dan's, you mean the zone?
Yeah, I think that's what he means.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Again, I you got to look at some of those streaming companies. Like the Zone is one of those that we talk about a lot with Todd here. And you remember they came out shot out of a cannon, and they shot $300 million contract to Canelo. But again, Canelo's going to fight twice a year. They also tried to sign, I think, Tyson Fury to a big contract. Again, but what are you going to do in the in between time? You're going to, I think Bare Knuckle is also experiencing this. Is that every once in a while they have a show and people want to watch it, and then they've got an audience that watches all their shows. But if you're going to pay, at some point, people are going to get their credit card bill, be like, "I'm paying $10 a month for this, and I don't use it anymore." The Zone did not have um even weekly shows or shows that they could show and they tried to with boxing and MMA and having a variety of stuff. But if you can't be consistent, you can't be you're going to want yeah, and the Zone kind of seems to have run out of money. I don't think, they're out there throwing around $300 million contracts anymore. I think they're still out there and I think they're still putting on shows, but um and I don't think you're going to get like a CBS or somebody like that to go ahead. Hey, Ranger. Yeah, yeah, of course. Brandon Bledsoe's another one of those guys. I think I put Brandon in there with George Masvidal at some point. But Bledsoe was a good little fighter, right? From the Midwest. Very interesting. Ranger, what's your full name? That was us probably. I bet you we dealt with that. I remember those Fight Zone shows. There was Newski's fought on them. Um, And they had an interesting thing. I think if I'm remembering the right shows, those were the shows where you guys would be fighting in the ring, and they would actually have somebody doing commentary, live commentary over the system microphone, over the event venue's PA system. So very interesting shows. You think the Zone's got backing from Saudi Arabia? Is that what you're telling me, Hamza? I was just talking to Todd earlier today. It's like, you know, at some point, I think the allure of being at these shows and funding the biggest shows and the biggest fights will get a little boring for Saudi Arabia. They have a lot of money, obviously, but they also have a lot of projects that go beyond sport, and sustainability is a little bit of an issue there. Thanks for joining us, David. Good to see you again. I got to be honest with you, I'm not sure I remember having dealt with you directly. If I did, I apologize. I killed a lot of brain cells at some point, but I definitely recognize the name as one of those guys that was there on the scene. And if you fought Bledsoe, it means you were down in the 135, 125, 145 pound weight class. And like I said, I thought in our heyday, the Midwest had the best fighters in those weight classes.
I don't know how much he would know about a specific UFC show, um, as far as what they made or lost. Don't you think, Miguel?
Okay, yeah. The other part about keep in mind in the U.S. we benefit from the that's a key component of what the boxing commissions bring. So what happens here is this: is in the U.S. you have a 8,000 page contract with the UFC, and the boxing commission forces them to sign 1 page deal where they disclose the bottom line pay for the fighters, and that's supposed to be a mechanism so that if the promoter doesn't pay, the boxing commission can go after them, and they've got both parties signed there. And that's the main source of where you see the disclosure of what people's salaries are. And again, that's just a minimum salary because it doesn't talk about sponsorships or pay-per-view money or anything like that. But when you see, oh, John Jones made this amount and the other guy made this, it's because the boxing commissions are the source of that. And in London, you don't have that. So I've never seen that. And by 2002, I was no longer attending UFCs. So I mean, I went to most of the Bob Meyerowitz UFCs, um, but by the time, and I went to the first Zuffa UFC, and after that, I stopped going. So yeah, I'm not sure how. I, I believe they should have gone back to London. If you guys have followed, um, yeah, yeah, Dave, those I saw. There were a lot of no time limit shows in the '90s. Jeff did one at Hook and Shoot where Brad Kohler fought Travis Fulton. They wound up fighting for 55 minutes. Um, and yeah, I'm a purist. I like that no time limit, no rounds, get up, that sort of thing. Um, so yeah, much respect for participating in that stuff, Dave. I appreciate it. And those are the kind of fights I actually think that there's room for that to come back, which would be no rounds, no time limits. You give everybody gloves, give everybody you can use whichever striking rules you want, prides or UFCs now or whatever, and administer the sport correctly. But I think that no time limit, no rounds, maybe even limit the amount of the uh stand ups and things that the referee has power over as well. Just have them administer to the end of the fight. That Wisniewski CJ Fernandez fight was something else. Um, Wisniewski was really concussed after that. He was messed up, had to go to the hospital, and then on Monday went to high school again. Keith is one of those guys that it's one of the all-time good guys of the sport in my book. I love that guy.
I was at his fight when Aoki broke his arm.
Oh, okay, yeah. See that was kind of Aoki has that little bit of a mean streak where he does that to him, and he'll be mean, and I I'm pretty sure he was trying to hurt Keith in that way with that move. So Keith by surprise, and there's some moves that are I don't want to say it's questionable. I guess it's in the rules and stuff like that, but you could have given a foreign fighter in a main event style fight a little bit more of a show and a little bit more of a chance. And Aoki did what he did. You know, is, is Aoki still fighting? I'm Todd. You there? Anybody?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm still putting out some of this stuff.
Cool, cool.
Yeah, I don't
Okay,
want to.
yeah.
But yeah, I'm trying to get some of. I got one last part where I'm putting it out at. I'm trying to get it distributed out to everybody.
I'll tell you that CJ Fernandez is one of those guys that I think he may have gotten it, maybe fought once in the UFC in the early days, maybe not, but he was managed by Brian Madden, who passed away. But he was a damn, damn, damn tough guy. right after he fought Wisniewski. He beat Wisniewski. His next fight was for us, and I put him in with Chris Lytle, and he slammed Lytle in the opening minute of the fight and broke Lytle's clavicle. And Lytle still got him in a triangle choke to win the fight. 4 minutes. He fought probably 3, 4 minutes with a broken clavicle. So yeah, CJ was the kind of guy who was dangerous, fight with anybody, and he had a draw with Aaron Riley on Brian Madden's show. I'm looking here that so that Fight Zone on show you fought was February 26th, 2000 is what it says here on SureDog. They're not perfect, but another one of our guys was a main event in that show. A guy named Scott Henze. Looks like Henze fought in a tournament. Uh, Looking through here, Bradley Burek. Yeah, these names. Nick Hyde was a tough guy, one of Lytle's teammates. Justin Wisniewski fought too. I see David Nags here beat Bledsoe. That seems like it was a war too, huh, David? 16 minutes? God damn. That's a. Well, I bet you weren't paid enough. I bet you weren't paid enough. You fought Dan Gilbert, was another one of our guys. Sean Wilmot was another one of our guys. So yeah, those guys were in our rotations. You went 1-1 with Wilmot, huh? So you fought him twice, lost a split decision, and then you got him with an armbar real quick. Good job, Dave. Wilmot was pretty tough. Also, he was one of Mike Brown's teammates from Massachusetts. So yeah, for sure. How come you didn't keep doing it, Dave? Just probably not getting paid enough. I bet. I bet that's the story, eh? You know. When you're fighting on those Fight Zone shows and the hook and shoot shows, you're going home with a couple of $100. So I don't blame you, but you had, according to Short Dog, you actually ended the game with a winning record, which not a lot of people do, man. That's awesome. That's awesome.
Life gets in the way for most of them, yeah.
Yep. Hamza, you're asking me about the GFL? Is that the geriatric fight league?
I don't think you watched our last episode, apparently.
Hamza, you're making me sad. If you're not watching our episodes, then who is? I'm just kidding, brother. But yeah, no, we did a whole episode on it, and I don't have a lot of faith in the GFL. They announced like a list of 50 fighters, of which most of the fighters, and they say stuff like, we have 8 UFC champions or former UFC champions, right? And yeah, you have eight, Junior Dos Santos, Fabrizio Wardun, guys are all over 40. So they may be hitting 45, you know? So I, this is a young man's sport. It's not a geriatric sport or something I want to watch, uh, you know, legends or whatever. I think we saw Bellator, the Hoist comeback, the Ken Shamrock comeback, and stuff like that. And really, the legends uh, get passed over really quick in this sport. It is a young man's sport. So and then the other part with the GFL to me will be the challenge I gave one, the challenge I gave Bellator, which they succeeded, but it's like do 25 shows and then get back to me. We'll see where they are after 25 shows. If they switched up their roster, if they've been able to sustain the show, or if they do 3 shows and are done. So yeah, that's just kind of my opinion. I'm not looking forward to. No, I never match made for King of the Cage. One of their matchmakers, King of the Cage used a variety of matchmakers. They also sold kind of like a franchise version so that people could use their name. So they had guys in Canada use their name, and I think one of the guys that was a matchmaker for them was a guy named Chris Benavidez. And Benavidez was originally from Texas, and when we did a Texas show with Hook and Shoot, Benavidez actually saved the day. Brought up like a half dozen guys from Mexico. None of them were super high skill, but they were all pretty willing to scrap. So that was the core of our show, and Benavidez ran with it from there to be king of the cage matchmaker, or at least for one of their franchises. Yep, zero money in it. Cool, cool, cool. Good, Dave. Dave, are you from Indiana? Because if you still do martial arts in Indiana or jujitsu in Indiana, I'm wondering if you're a student of Klingerman, because Klingerman would go back to those days as one of the real pioneers in my book. You know, a lot of guys have a lot of respect for him. I know Klingerman's still around, so that's just a question. Yeah, 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 exactly. One of the guys on the GFL list is Vanderlei Silva, and Silva's one of those guys with the CTE is a real problem in this sport because we don't really have enough of a history to say, there's guys that are retired 5, 6, 7 years. It's like, okay, what are they going to look like 20 years in? If they had long careers and CTE really becomes a problem. Sure, CTE is going to be a problem for some guys. We talked about Keith Wisniewski. Glad to report that Keith is an iron worker and has a family and travels and does rock climbing and stuff like that with his kids, and he's still you know in good shape. But Keith is a guy who, towards the end of his career, was definitely beginning to have a little bit of problems with that. I remember one fight that he probably asked me half a dozen times that night how the fight ended. So yeah, see, I'm good. Good, Dave. You're a smart man for getting out of the game. Not only the money, but keep your head together. So good thing.
It's sad that the money's still an issue now. I mean, a lot of guys are bailing out still because of that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. Extreme Challenge was Monty's show, and I can't take credit for it. Monty was a one man army. He did a bunch of shows and stuff. I can't take credit for matchmaking for him. We actually Monty recently asked me. He's like, "Why don't we never do shows together?" And it just didn't work out. I like doing my own thing. Jeff gave me a lot of leeway and to do things my way. So I enjoyed that. But I helped Monty with Extreme Challenge. He'd call me and we'd send fighters there. I'd use his fighters and stuff. Monty, we were talking about rings. Monty also did a couple of shows under the flag of Rings USA, which were pretty good, pretty intense shows. Um, in Iowa and stuff like that. So yeah, the Extreme Challenge. I think Monty's rolled out that brand again, and he's did some shows this year, under the Extreme Challenge name again. So, but Monty's a businessman. I would, and he definitely knows talent. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that I would have used. I think he had Pat Miletich do a boxing match against. I forget the guy's name, but he was a pro boxer just recently, and I like Pat. You know, we had Pat on the Hook and Shoot show do an exhibition one time. Um, but again, I'm not a fan of guys that are retired coming back and going in the ring. And I think if you consider what we recently were watching with Mike Tyson, I think I guess the biggest example of why that it doesn't work. Like I said, I'd rather watch polished 25 year olds who don't have huge names fight than I would anybody under these types of legendary stuff. Now, jujitsu might be a different story. Jujitsu, grappling, there might be a spot there for some of these older guys, but yeah, you don't want to see Vanderlei Silva grappling, do you?
Yeah, I mean, but I don't know. I mean, some of the guys, if they have an opportunity to make money without sustaining significant damage, I guess, you know.
Yeah, again, money shouldn't be the driving issue for anybody, but it is. It's
But it
going to
is,
be.
unfortunately, yeah.
It's going to be, but the GF, but what strategy is the GFL? You know, they said they secured their funding, and then they went out and signed a roster full of 50-year-olds. Um, Keep in mind before the Zuffa takeover, um, Bob Meyerowitz actually did match pull off 3 shows in Japan. And they were squarely looked at
More
as
than the UFC's done. The
yeah.
more than Zuffa's done to this day. Haven't they only done like one?
I'd have to look. They have so many shows. I don't want to
Maybe one or two tops.
I don't want to be wrong on that. But yeah, they did 3 shows and they were firmly going over there
Hmm.
in foreign territory and looked at as competition. Shudo didn't like to work with anybody. And then, for example, so Shudo, when
Their integrity was very important to them. You know,
yes,
they
yes,
didn't want anybody kind of tainting that.
for example, the main reason they didn't work with Pancrase, for example, is because they consider, and many people, including John Peretti, still consider that Pancrase had a history of doing worked fights at some point. So did Rings, and that was the death of anybody working with Shooter. They were not going to do anybody even associated with something like a fake fight. The other part of it is, and they did this to us at Hook and Shoot. They did it to Ironheart Crown. They did it to TJ. Um, is they force you to use their rules. So I don't think the UFC, especially back in those days, was going to change their rules over to do judo's rules, which would have included catch, which I like the catch, and I consider that with Troy Waugh and with Sean Brockmull as our main refs, that we had maybe two of the best refs out there and guys that understood how to implement the catch in the game. But I don't think you know. I think that was part of the showstopper. And I want you, if they even talked about it, then coming to a conclusion as to we changed our rules. We flat changed our rules so that we could use Shudo's name, and then that gave them a certain amount of power. The UFC wasn't going to do that at that point. Even with keep in mind Joe Silva really wasn't matchmaker until the Zuffa stuff. He was a consultant, and he loved Shudo. He might have pushed for it, but again, once you start getting into these types of politics, and the other part of it is pre Zuffa, um, the UFC was basically a heavyweight show. I mean, they had Pat Miletich, I guess, had come in at 170, and they had the 200-pound weight class, and they had above that, but they were basically a big man show. They didn't have 155 pounders or anything like that. So, um, yeah, I think that is kind of a purist way of looking at things, but I don't think the politics were right pre-Zuffa for that type of mixing up of the shows.
Holmes, I think you're off there. I think they felt Sakurai could beat anybody, and Anderson Silva wasn't, you know, some kind of big thing at that point. He was just a guy from Shoot Box that they put in the fight, and it was a tough matchup for Sakurai because of their styles. But I don't think they felt like, oh, we're gonna get him beat. They felt Sakurai could beat anybody at that time.
Yeah, and I'd like to check, but keep in mind that Anderson really blew up once he hit Pride and the UFC. I'm going to just check so I'm not making any mistakes here
And to give you
on.
some background, I mean, I don't know if you know, but I lived in Oahu for a very long time, and our exposure to MMA, I would say, in Hawaii was more based around the Japanese events, Shuto, Pride, Pancrase, and we had a VHS rental place that had a lot of these Japanese fights because the owners were Japanese, and it was across from the Blaisdell Arena where TJ had his shows. So we were all really exposed to the Shuto fighters. We knew who all those guys were, and that was our favorite organization too. So I had been watching those fights, and the fights like you mentioned, Sakurai, Anderson Silva, these fights. I've been watching those, and I don't think Shuto had any intentions of getting him beat or anything like that. They just put him in the fight, and to their credit, Shuto's I would like Miguel was saying. I think Shuto at that time, to me, was the best organization in the world. They had the best amateur circuit. They built fighters up through that. They had their All Japan tournament, which you could also get promoted to pro through. And I think the best fighters in Japan came from Shuto, the overwhelming majority. You had a few that didn't, like Sakuraba, but the majority of them came through Shuto. And so they did a great job of building fighters to a high level skill. So I don't necessarily think they were worried about getting somebody beat. It was more,
Yeah, I don't think that they were trying
yeah,
to. If I had to pin it down for you, Hamza, I think if you, I'm looking at Anderson Silva's record. Anderson fought for Shudo against Tetsuji Kato first, and Kato was another one of those guys. Maybe people don't remember him, but Kato was tough. Kato was, you know,
he was
like like
probably
like
Ensign's top fighter before Kid Yamamoto.
so Tetsuji Kato was tough, and when Anderson beat Tetsuji Kato, he probably said, "Okay, now we get Sakurai so that we get him." That's probably the thinking that they were doing is the escalation there. I'm surprised they didn't use Nakao for that fight, Jutara Nakao, because Nakao was another guy like there was a brick shithouse from those days with
Yeah,
Shudo.
no
Um,
doubt.
and and then after that, and even those days, those are good wins. Sakurai and Kato are very good wins. But then you get into the politics of uh, you know, why did he not fight for Shudo again? Oh, well, okay, because he went and fought for Pride. So that rules you out of Shudo almost right away in those back in those old days. Then he had the audacity to lose to Takase and Chonin in somebody else's show. So Anderson was never going to come back to Shudo after that. And Chonin being and Kase being from different organizations in Shudo, they didn't start there. Yeah, Shudo legitimately would rule out fighters if they fought on those shows, and that's one thing that pretty clearly did.
It was a
Um,
testament to Shudo that a lot of their stars, I mean, a couple of them ended up going to Pride, like Sakurai Gomi, but Rumina never went. Uno never went. A lot of their good fighters never went to Pride. They
yeah,
stayed in Shuto. They were loyal to that organization. They believed in it.
I think Sato is the biggest case of that. Because at one point Uno left to go to UFC, and then again, once you've done that, you never go back to Shudo. So Shudo would let guys go. And here's the end of it is at some point, I would say it's an open question whether Rumina Sato ever made more than $20,000 for a fight. Shudo had a cap on what they could pay. They were never going to be a guy, people who could sustain big money fighters, so they would always have people leave for more money to the other shows. And that's one of the other things that the other shows would do is come up with a big paycheck and draw guys away from them. And Shudo could never compete with that. Some guys stayed because of loyalty. Sato, to me, is you know maybe the best fighter from the '90s, best guy we ever saw. You know what I mean? But I think he also was a guy that once he started to take losses and stuff, he started questioning himself. And I think also with him that he was just like I don't know how you want to quantify Michael Jordan, Bo Jackson. Like he was a super athlete, and once you're in your late 20s, mid 20s, at some point, in that edge of athleticism, you lose a step, kind of thing. That I think really hurt Sato also. But yeah, those guys, yeah, but that's what it was with Shudo. Shudo was political machine more than anything, and they could be very arrogant in terms of they thought they were the best, the only people who understood what purity of the sport was. And at the end of the day, they may still be around, but they never broke big.
I got an interesting story about Takashi right around that fight, too, because I was living in Japan at that time. And there's a place called G Square. It was in a, I think it was in a Gold's Gym, if I remember correctly. And it was a private room. You couldn't go there unless you were invited or knew somebody who brought you there. And Rambo brought me there, and It was like Yoshida, Takasi, um, Nakamura, the judoka. Um, who was the other guy? Several guys from Pride. Yokoi was one of them also. And
Okay.
then guys like Josh Barnett would come there, Genki Sudo. It was mostly bigger guys though, but it was a who's who of guys that were good. Machida would come there. But the guy who was the best guy on the ground in that room was Takasi. And anybody would tell you that. And so when the fight happened, and he ended up beating him, on the ground, it was not necessarily shocking because he would whip up guys in that room, who were great grapplers, which Anderson wasn't. Takasi was an outstanding grappler, so he had that in him. His fight career was a little, kind of up and down, but he
Yeah,
had he had that kind of performance in him.
and the gym, guys in the gym you can find guys that are heroes in the gym and sometimes have a little struggle with competition. But yeah, the thing about those Japanese guys, Kase, even Chonin, guys like that maybe have up and down careers, um, they were putting in a lot of work. They were already professional fighters, whereas, on the state side, guys that still had to have a job and stuff like that.
They had a lot of experience in competing, whether it was in fighting or grappling shows, or they competed a lot, so it didn't shock
I,
me
I
that he was able to do that.
Sure, sure. No, I defer to you. You saw them in the room too, so that's definitely a good. I'm looking at Super Shotgun. Uh, I agree. You could. That's another one of those things where we've been talking a little bit about the GFL, or guys like legends fighting, or whatever you want to call it, retired guys coming back and things like that. And yeah, it drives me crazy too. It's, I did a podcast with a guy recently, and he asked me who the top five MMA guys of all time are, and I would probably put Anderson at three, and that's regardless of what he was doing at the end. I think at the end also keep in mind who did he lose to in boxing? Did he do a boxing match? Did he lose to Jake Paul? What was the boxing match that he did? At some point,
Yeah,
Anderson.
early in the fight, it looked like he was just kind of playing around with him. I don't even, like I said, any of Jake Paul's fights, I doubt the authenticity of any of them. So,
And that's the thing at that point, Anderson is, top three all time in MMA, and he's not top three all time pay, right? So at some
he
point, and
beat
again,
Chavez Jr. the fight before that.
okay, and Chavez Jr. is kind of, you know, average. He's not a great fighter. Um, but yeah, so I consider Anderson is a guy who, towards the end of his career, was doing things for the money. Especially one of the problems with the MMA guys in Brazil, especially those early guys, and you can still hear stories of guys like this, is in Brazil, you've got um, name recognition now with the MMA guys. All of a sudden, we're as recognized as soccer players, and they're making an absolute fraction of what soccer players make in Europe. And if you think you're going to run around and run, Bigfoot Silva is a good example of a guy that the story I heard was that he bought his wife and daughter Porsches, like the German luxury car. It's like, if you made $200,000 for a fight, you've just lost it all on Porsches. Meanwhile, the soccer players are making 200 million on their contracts, or 20, even 20 million. You can afford a couple of Porsches, but you can't on an MMA guy's salary. And I think that's one of the things that happened for Anderson is clearly, during his heyday, he was the best fighter on the planet. Now recognized in Brazil, you start thinking that you're not making the money of those types of athletes, and he spent a lot of his money from the early days. He wasn't a guy who managed his money real smart. So I think a lot of what we saw at the end of his career was that he was more mature at that point, maybe being matched by people who were going to handle his money a little bit better. But yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm looking at Chavez. I don't mean to put Chavez Jr. down. I mean, the problem with Chavez Jr. to me is that his dad's, an all-time great, and he just was never going to reach that. He was also kind of born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and I think at some point was lazy and didn't put in the work. Actually, the last boxing match I went to live was Chavez Jr. against Sebastian Zvick. Still have a Chavez Jr. hat from that show and the shirt. So I was a fan. I had high hopes for Chavez Jr. at some point, but I think, yeah, I think, he, he wasn't the murderous worker that his dad was. He also, and his dad and him, they had their own problems and stuff. But I think that, yeah, in certain cases, you're not going to reach what your father did. Sometimes the hope would be right that the second generation is actually better. And I think that those expectations for Chavez Jr. were really what killed him. That when that's one of my favorite Anderson Silva fights is when he beat Bonner. Um, and
Yeah.
Bonner at that point was doing it for the money. He showed up to fight Anderson in Brazil, which is a freaking tall order. He showed up roided to the gills, and rest in peace, Stefan. I'm not talking bad about you at all, my friend, um, but yeah, he showed up, making muscles in the weigh-ins and stuff, and getting attention from Brazilian girls and that sort of stuff, and he was embarrassed by Anderson. He was embarrassed. Anderson really did a number on Bonner and Forrest Griffin. If you look at it, the guys who people credit for making the UFC, Anderson so dominated both of those guys that I think there's a good reason and example why I would probably put him third on the all-time MMA list.
Yeah.
And if you want to hear it, I would put uh, Fedor is number one and Roy Jones is number two. Um, I'm not a huge St. Pierre fan, but I guess he would be one of the guys on there. Um, I might go with an eclectic pick like a Dan Henderson who on there as well. But that's Anderson clearly belongs on that. If you disrespect, that's the thing about newbie fans too. I that's why I don't even like to talk to newbie fans and stuff. It's like I I took a guy to Brazil to fight Rafael Cordero, who was shootbox's kickboxing instructor, and we became friends with the shootbox guys. They actually, I fought. I'm sorry, I had a fighter fight where I worked as corner, and joining me in the corner were Rudimar and Pele. It's like when when Vanderlei Silva fought Vitor and got smoked. We had gotten to know them also, and he was like, "Oh, you're an American reporter, so," and he was like, "I'll give you an interview, but you're the only reporter from the USA we're going to talk to." So when people disrespect these guys, and you've been through some of that stuff with them, yeah, it's disgusting. People don't have a history for it. Back in those old days too, like Todd was pointing out, you know, there was a culture of like, "Hey, I'm getting a box of tapes," and you sat and you watched older fights and and there was a point where I think, you can count on a couple of hands, a couple Brazilian guys, a couple of Japanese guys, myself, maybe guys like Todd too, where we saw every fight that was going on in the world, every fight, because there weren't weekly shows and there weren't small shows here and small shows there. Now you can't keep up with it. It's like you have NBA Fight Pass or I'm sorry, Major League Baseball Pass or whatever. You may be able to watch a lot of Major League Baseball, but nowadays you'd also be forced to watch A ball, double A ball, triple A ball. You can't keep up with it. You can't watch every game, and you can no longer watch every fight.
I saw, I think it was Super Shotgun asking about Yuki Nakai. One thing I would say about him, while his career was cut short, he's produced a lot of fighters from his Pro Wrestler, chain. And, Taito, who's fighting in the UFC right now, is from one of his gyms. And so often when you see him fight, you see Ryuta Matsuni in his corner, who's kind of like his main coach, and he was a champion at Shuto. And so, yeah, Nakai still has a lot of guys coming out of his pipeline that are having success in MMA through the through the gyms he's created. He's probably not specifically training them. I'm sure he's training them some because he still does that, but um, the guys he's created, through Shuto's history, are producing guys now still. So he's left his mark.
Oh yeah, Yuki Nakai. I agree with you. I think he would count as probably from those days one of the top legends of the game. I'm trying to remember. Oh, I just found his name. My favorite old Shudo guy from those days was a guy named Noboru Asahi. Um, and Asahi was one like the predecessor to Rumi Sato. Like he came the generation before, but Asahi was a superstar. Like he'd win a fight and he'd climb the ropes and do the whole show and stuff like that. And that's what those Shudo guys understood too. Is they understood the purity of the sport, but then also the that it was for showmanship as well.
Yeah, when he got beat by Pequeño, that really put Pequeño on the map, because he choked him out really bad, and then he did it again. In the rematch, he just did it again. And both times it was really scary looking. Like those probably some of the. If you want to see a guy get choked out real bad, those two fights were. Shooto's
Hamza,
great
you
refs. Shooto's great refs, but he just didn't see it. Ogata didn't see it the first time.
Hamza, you would put Henderson ahead of Fedor? I put Henderson in my top five, but I'm not sure about that. Frank Shamrock's a good choice, I guess. I think I'm trying to think who. But I do Fedor. I put John Jones in there just because I'm not a huge fan of his, or I'm not against if people don't want to include him. So I respect your point, but the guy really has been almost untested. Really, there are a couple of fights, like that he's had that people say, oh, he slipped a little bit or whatever. I don't think he's come close to losing any of those fights. Even the first fight with the Swedish guy that people like to say he lost, he didn't lose that fight. Come on, you know. I rate Fedor number one because Fedor fought guys like Hongman Choi, things like that. Um, there's just an X factor to fighting guys double your size that you cannot. Anything could go wrong, kind of thing. And Fedor just achieved that. That's the one thing he has on Jones. I wonder what would have happened if Fedor had fought John Jones both in their prime. Um, yeah, I think Frank Shamrock is definitely a good choice for that list. Anderson. I don't like Saint Pierre. In terms of I think he really was kind of boring. Um,
No, I didn't fight in the NHB. I trained for a long time though. I mean, probably about 17, 18 years. But yeah, I didn't do any fighting. Just been around the sport a long time, and have a lot of passion for it, like Miguel. And
yeah,
this kind of stuff, we always say this kind of stuff we probably would talk about anyway, but we just record it, so
yeah,
so to
no, and
speak.
Shotgun, that choke documentary is a big deal. And
Hmm.
that tells you a little bit of Nakai's story. I think, if I remember correctly, and we talked to Ensign Inoue about that,
Hmm.
Nakai actually and I think the reason I asked the question I asked Ensign is how did Gerard Gordeau even get out of Japan after doing that to him? And Nakai to keep fighting in that show actually lied to the doctors. So he hid the fact that his eye was freaking. He's partially blind now from that day. Um, but yeah, he did not let the doctors know that he had been injured so that he can continue fighting. That's the kind of spirit that those guys had. You know what I mean? So yeah, then Nakai to me goes down as another one of those people that if you don't respect Yuki Nakai, then you really don't know this sport.
Yeah, Ryan Boat told me he can't drive in Japan. Um, One thing I was gonna we mentioned offline before we started this, you guys may not know, but Sakuraba's son is fighting this weekend. So for guys who are on this chat, that might interest you, since we're hardcores here. That should be an interesting news point to see how he does in Ryzen.
Yeah, Hamza, like I said, I'll put Henderson in my top five. Fedor fought guys double his size too. I think Fedor also had a little bit longer winning streak. I think, um, you know, I think it's a good conversation to have. So I don't think that's uh, I don't think that's a bad choice. I remember going back to that. I remember um, seeing Henderson's first fights, and that we talked a little bit about getting that videotape in the mail. And the first fight he ever did was in Brazil. Um, I remember a bunch of funny stories. I think he fought Crazio de Souza in his first fight in Brazil, and Crazio de Souza was in Abu Dhabi one year, and the guys that were doing the tournament booklet for Abu Dhabi, put his name wrong. Crazinho is his nickname, and they had him as Crazy Ho. It's just stupid shit I remember. But uh, but yeah, Henderson was impressive from the very beginning. Hamza, like I said, yeah, uh I won't say you're wrong. He's in my conversation too. I think I have a lot of, the bottom line is I think a lot of people wouldn't even put Henderson in their top five or that thing. So just much respect for your recognition of him. I've put him there too. Um, I you know maybe I'm a little smitten with Fedor, but I think Fedor was all that and more. Um, I got to meet Dan Henderson one time. He came, I think, with Chael to corner in Atlantic City, and I remember him. Uh, yeah, he was one of those guys that when I talk about this stuff too. One of the other things I like to say, kind of maybe to illustrate a picture, is if you had a picture, so what we watch is sport, okay? So what would you do? Who would you pick to go fight next to you in a ditch in World War I, and you're, you know, fighting to the freaking death with people? And Henderson is one of those guys. No, no, he beat
The guy I'm
Fedor.
really impressed with from Japan, and we haven't seen a whole lot of guys that we were impressed with, but uh, Tyra I think's done pretty well, even though he lost his last fight. But the one who I'm more impressed with than Asakura is Rinya Nakamura, who kind of has like the Kid Yamamoto background. That was his favorite fighter, and he was a great wrestler like Kid. And he's 9-0. He's won his think see he's had one, two, three, four, 5 fights. Two of them are road to UFC, and the other three were in the UFC. He's won all of them. Um, and That's a guy who I think, if there is a guy who's going to make their mark, it would be him because he has that wrestling, high level of wrestling skill that you know, Japan has still kind of struggled to pick up from the wrestling community. Because I mean, I went to Japanese nationals and I saw so many guys that like they could have slaughtered people that easily, you know. And
Yeah.
there was a guy I used to train with, Joji Miyabi, on the military base, and I took him. We took him to rodeo style, and he clobbered those guys. Experienced fighters, you know,
Yeah.
Kotani brothers and some of these other guys, and he would wipe the floor with those guys. And he didn't do any fighting. He would wipe the floor with those guys. So I think Japan still does a bad job of and you know it's not easy because they're wanting to have those guys in the Olympics, but
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
have a
Keep in
lot of
mind,
If you go Japanese nationals, that you'll see some incredible talent there.
you may actually wind up there with a political game where like the wrestling organizations do not allow their guys to do MMA. You know, um, I forget which fighter or whatever, but there was the story of the boxing commission won't let the boxers do MMA or even be involved with them. They look down at it, much to the point where one of the coaches was helping an MMA guy, and he actually attended the fight and worked his corner in a disguise so that the boxing commission wouldn't find out that he was working. So yeah, there are heavy politics in Japan. With their honor code is something that I'm not from that culture, so I have an understanding of it, and I do know that times I won't understand it, but I will play a role, such as you know we've been talking about in this podcast. Pancrase Shudo rings, they killed each other, and if they had worked together, it would have been a heyday of the sport, even higher than what we've seen. You know what I mean?
Yeah, Hamza Renya won the under 23 world championship. I think it was 50. He won at 61 kilos. So yeah, you're right. Japan has a lot of talented guys at the smaller weights in wrestling for sure.
Yeah, Deep
And,
Deep was another one of those shows too that it was involved in the politics. I did um with Bodog, we did some crossover shows. I actually match made a few shows in Japan, which a lot of people don't get to do. And we worked with Mars, which was a show. And the deal with Mars was that, and this is stuff that how the hell would I even know? Um, but and Mars was Korean mafia. And what happens is the owners of Mars were third or fourth generation born in Japan. They had changed their names to Japanese names, but amongst themselves, they all know these guys are Koreans. They're not Japanese, and that uh, made Mars a marginal show, and it gave them some prejudices. Whereas they couldn't draw huge named fighters from Japan in that area because of that stuff. Oh, is Ryan Garcia doing? Was he doing an MMA or kickboxing fight in Risen?
no, he's gonna box somebody, one of their K1 champions,
Oh, okay.
a bigger guy, and De Loy said he was gonna sue him, and that was that.
I did join that Discord group. It's hard for me to be consistent on a new platform like that. Like Todd was like, "Hey, they're asking about you." I jumped on. I sat there for 2 hours, and the conversation had kind of died. And and I haven't been back a million, often enough. But I do think and here's the other thing, not to, but like Risen is kind of off my radar. I know they're the big show now in Asia and stuff like that, but I don't really follow it all that much. Like I look at the listings, I look at the results and things like that, but like I don't recall really watching too much Risen. So yeah, but yeah, no, these discussions are all a lot of fun. As you can obviously tell, I can friggin' talk about this, through all day, all night. What's an a quarry question? I don't think if you're asking me if Henderson was coaching Nate Quarry on my show, the answer is no. Um, yeah, I never booked Quarry. Yeah, yeah, shotgun. I do. You know, we've done that conversation a few times. Yeah, I am extremely unimpressed with Don Davis. I think Todd and is probably getting tired of hearing me talk about it, but you're talking about a guy. First of all, even the Fertitas, and you talk about guys like that. Don Davis is a billionaire, but he's running around getting money for the show, and he's not a guy that's passionate enough about it that he's spending his own money. And I know it's hard to say that's the difference, but yeah, when you're talking about passion for the sport, he's also talking about how he doesn't watch MMA. You know, um, we were talking offline before. He went out and bought Bellator and has just complete Bellator. You know, I criticize Bellator all the time, but Bellator at the end of the day had a solid roster of fighters in every weight class. He had a lot of stuff established, and he's absolutely destroyed whatever it is he bought them for. He's done nothing with them. So yeah, to me, Don Davis, you know, he should go back to AOL or wherever. I don't remember what his original company was that he made billions of dollars off of, but he's completely worthless in this sport. Completely worthless.
I think Miguel always makes great points when it comes to new guys in the game. Do they have the passion to lose for a long period of time to lose money? And it's not even their own money. You know, the UFC, Zuffa, they lost their own money, and they were willing. They almost gave up on it, but they were willing to eat it for that long, and these guys wouldn't be, and I'm sure their investors won't be willing to eat it for that long. Although ONE FC seems to have got some people that were willing to lose a lot of money. But yeah,
Yeah,
you
I
got to
think
be willing to lose millions and millions and millions of dollars to have any chance of success. And most people aren't willing to do that.
what's the name of the owner of one?
Chatri Sichutan.
Okay, yeah, I would put him on the list of passionate people about the sport. Whether you like it or not, whatever their business practices are, whatever it is they're doing, I would put him as a guy who actually loves the sport,
Yeah, you
sits
can
and
tell
watches it.
by the fighters he has. You know, he's
Yeah,
got a
and the people you know, going out and getting Matt Hume to work with you and things like that. He's clearly done his homework as to who's who, and
I
you know,
mean, those ties he has in those shows and some of those stand-up fights, those guys are incredible.
yeah, yeah, for
You know,
sure.
you see
Um,
him take full-on kicks and hits to the body over and over again that would fold any MMA fighter in one shot. And these guys are just taking full baseball bat shots to the, where their whole ribs are all red and blue, and they're still
yeah,
fighting like nothing happened. Incredible guys to watch fight.
um, KSW is that Polish show, right?
Yeah,
Again, without any insider knowledge, but I would say that that KSW show is a mafia run show. Just Eastern Europe. Just I'm making an assumption. I don't have any real proof. And once you're doing that, um, I think it will prevent you from being a worldwide show. I think we saw it with M1 Global. With M1 Global really only a name. Um, and yeah, that's just kind of my opinion on that one. Is ASW's been around for a long time. They've had stars and stuff, but I think that they've figured out how to make money on their market. And the other thing is, and this is our speculation with one also. And one I do have some experience with. Um, those contracts that KSW has with their fighters and one has with their fighters might even be illegal in the U.S. The types of rights and things that they give up, that and you know, they operate. under different laws in their countries, so they're going to be legal in their countries, but they might be illegal in the U.S. I can tell you, you know, and, at this point, when one fought in Denver, they did their one show in Denver. Um, I I don't want to say I was the matchmaker for a fight, but I did procure Tang's opponent. Who's their champion? The guy who fought Demetrius Johnson. I
Yeah,
don't want to
Rod Tank.
mispronounce it. Yeah, Tang.
That's what I'm
So
talking
I,
about. Some of these ties. I mean, he might be one of my favorite people to watch in all of combat sports.
yep, I got his opponent out of Mexico. I helped them book him. That kid from Mexico, for a Mexican Thai fighter, gave him a pretty decent fight. I think Rotang is enough of a showman that maybe carried him a little bit, but the Mexican kid didn't embarrass himself. He lasted into the second round before he got stopped. Um, I think he went to the well one or two times too often. He was throwing a spinning back elbow kind of thing. That was a pretty nice, tricky move. Um, he missed it, and then he kept trying it, and that's when he got caught. But I'll tell you here. So I got a hold of this kid in Mexico. I told him, I said, look, I've got this opportunity for you. Um, and he was game. He jumped on it. He was absolutely to work with, and he deserved it. Um, but and it came down to it. Here's one of the things where it's like, I don't like to talk about my, and I am not even saying I'm the. This is why I talk about purity of the sport. That fight, he deserved it. It had to be made. Most people would have taken a percentage of his money for booking the fight. But when I saw what one was offering him for a world championship fight against that guy, I felt embarrassed. Even if, 10% of the money would have been a three-figure payday for me. So it's not like you know, I, I could probably use the money, but I can't. I just can't do that to the guy. So I told him, I said, look, all I need for you to do is be a reference for me and just say that I legitimately got you the fight. And if I ever need to book somebody in Mexico, we're there. But again, the contract one offered him, I don't think, uh, I don't think it's actually going to be something that they could sustain and really get talent in the U.S. And I think the same thing may be occurring with guys like KSW and stuff. I think that if you're a Polish fighter, they own you.
Well, Rod Tank's going to fight Takero, so I think that's going to be an interesting fight. Because Takero will war with him, but yeah, I don't think any. To me, like I said, he's the most entertaining fighter. He's a showman when he's out there. He gets hit, it doesn't bother him. He wants more of it. The last fight, they were in the clinch. The guy was elbowing him, and he just started banging his head into the guy's elbow. Just bam. The ref made him stop. They were in the clinch. Yeah, Rod Tank's
Hamza
a great entertainer.
Hamza, I agree with you completely. I think Rugerg is just he's one of the modern guys that I enjoy watching fight. I
Yeah,
can't say that too often.
you got to
It'd
give
be
one their credit. They have several guys that are incredible talents.
well, here's that's why I think the owner knows his stuff, and if he doesn't know his stuff completely, he's got Hume there, and I think Hume is kind of an unsung genius. Like he doesn't get the credit in the states he deserves, and stuff like that. But I don't think there's a single better, uh, more talented dude than that guy. Um, and he could be a little bit maybe I don't arrogant might be the right word, maybe difficult to deal with, which is why the UFC never really had a long-standing relationship with him. But Hume, if anybody's going to assess talent, Hume is you know one of the maybe top two or three people at assessing talent in the world today at this. It's kind of you know, I might rate Peretti in there, and I might keep myself in there. you know,
And Dana White trying to
but
get in this jiu-jitsu thing, like Chatri did with his event. You know, he went out there and got Mikey Masumechi from took him from one. So he's kind of and like he's saying here, Super Shotgun. He's saying one's 4 ounce glove Muay Thai fights. They are so good that that's what Dana White should have got into instead of this power slap nonsense. You know.
Yep. Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, don't get me started on power slap, but yeah, I think at the same time that um one gets a little disconnected because they have so many different set. Like for example, um, they signed Ryan Gordon or Gordon Ryan. What's his name? The ADCC champion.
Gordon Ryan. Gordon Ryan. Yeah.
I I keep wanting to call him Ryan Gordon, but it's Gordon Ryan. I mean, he was under one contract, and they never did anything with him. And
Yep. Yep.
that's one of those things where on a matchmaking level, um, if Don Davis knew what the hell he was doing, I think that putting Gordon Ryan or Ryan Gordon or Gordon Ryan in against Francis would have been the match to make.
You know, UFC never would have found a guy like Rug Rug.
No, no,
You know that's you know what you're talking about with Joshua. You got to give him credit for those because UFC
yeah,
never would have found that guy.
and that comes from the fact is like for example, um, I think I don't want to mispronounce names and stuff. I'm not an expert on Muay Thai, and um, there's an even more rugged version of Muay Thai called Left Way, so something
Yeah.
like
Yep.
that comes out of Burma,
Right.
and
You can headbutt and it's
yeah,
no gloves.
that's the kind of idea. Once you start really scouring the world, that Senegal stuff that they do, I've seen versions of some of those African fights where they actually tie together and stuff. I mean, being tied to a guy that you have to fight is a whole different ball. That's kind of like what we were talking about fighting in a ditch in World War II, and that's what some of those fights look like. Um, African guys not doing it for the money, doing it for the pride, and doing it for being their reputation and stuff like that. I think that that is one of the things that sets one apart. But I think that there are variations of different rules and different sports and stuff. They also, I think, shoot themselves in the foot because, I've given them a list of guys from Latin America. A kid from Chile was like 15-1. They were like, nah, he lost. So, okay, then, we'll keep looking for undefeated guys that aren't in the UFC or aren't, under contract to House or whoever. But, by the time they're 3-0, um,
Because Pride was doing a lot of the stuff that one is doing. They were looking for. They wanted to have that feel of we got these guys from these different continents or these different countries who are experts in this, and this. You know, we have all these guys. We're like the Olympics. You know, and I think one is trying to borrow from that. You know, and that's part of it that I really like because you're seeing guys that you would never see these guys in the UFC, and they're so talented. Some of these, even ones like Stamp, who's crossed over into MMA. You know,
yeah.
she's a star. You know, and Rod Tang, like I said, Super Lek, um,
I think
Super
they have
Bond, all these ties that they have.
I think they have an
Tuan Chai.
advantage in
You
those
know,
countries. They have an advantage too because I think at the end of the day, guys that are 125, 135 pounds are going to have a limited market in the States. Just whereas in those countries where maybe people are a little smaller or whatever, um, maybe the heavyweights don't have that appeal. They're maybe also more astute at looking at skill because the smaller guys are always going to be more skilled than the big guys. Um, but yeah, Hamza, don't worry about it. Don Davis doesn't have a brain, so forget about that one.
it'd be sad if one goes away because where do those guys go? You know, they keep competing in Thailand, I guess, but a lot of really talented guys, you're not going to see them anymore unless the UFC has the foresight to snatch some of them up.
Yeah, Ruger could come fight for the UFC. The problem with that is, again, ego and stuff like that. You could see Rugru come over and get beat, and that would be a disservice to a guy that they should bring along and nurture. I'm not saying it's easy to beat him, but if they just grabbed him and stuck him in with John Jones, he's probably not going to be favored in that fight. You know what I mean? And that's the kind of stupid stuff those guys would do. Um, at UFC. Yeah, no,
The
those
guy that
guys.
Sakuraba's son is debuting against is very experienced. Yachi is a really experienced fighter. I don't understand that.
Yeah, it should be interesting. I'm actually when I heard Sakuraba's son was fighting, I I may actually try to watch that. You know what I mean? I
Yeah,
think that's a cool thing. Um, yeah, it's not in any way, shape, or form important, but it's funny because I'm not a huge dude at all. Um, with- when I stood next to Sakuraba, we could exchange shirts. We were almost like identical stature. And so that makes him even more remarkable to me because, yeah, Sakuraba was the best in the world in his moment. So,
yeah, Rug Rug is like one Zinganu. He's just a monster. Yeah,
yeah, Jay, it might be a tough fight for John, but I keep in mind in under UFC rules, and Jones is such a guy who knows how to use, like, Ruger could get a eye poke in that fight early, and Jones would be like, oh, I think he does that on purpose. Little kicks to the knee, stuff like that. Jones is the reason I give him some credit is because Jones is really cerebral and not in like who was the guy I was talking about? Oh, okay. Chimaev is the other guy I was talking about. You got guys like Nurmagomedov and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, Nurmagomedov is. I think Chimaev is actually like a guy who I think Nurmagomedov is more of a competitor. I think Chimaev is more of a life and death kind of guy, and I think Jones is one of those guys where he once he gets into the game, he will do whatever it takes. And that's a Rug, with his background, of course, he would also. But um, yeah, no, we haven't. Like I said, I don't think Jones has really had any risk in MMA yet. Like there are a couple of fights against Reyes or I forget all those guys, and then the Swedish guy that people actually say that he might have lost that fight or whatever. I don't see that in those fights. And I judged MMA. Um, I just don't. I think he's won every single fight.
yeah, maybe Rug Rug is the best heavyweight in the world. Maybe.
Who's that? Did he fight that Russian guy that one has? They have.
Yeah, he beat him
Yeah, he did.
in their last
Okay.
fight. Yeah, it was close fight, but he won.
Because I saw him fighting a blonde guy. That's not the guy I'm talking about. There's another dude. Let me let me see if I can look him up. Because I saw him fighting a blonde guy who was a little smaller, Rug. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just things starting to run together.
He's 32 though, so he's not young. He's
Okay, so the guy I'm talking about him fighting was that I saw was Batraz Gazayev, but that's not the guy that you guys are talking about. So he fought Anatoly already.
yes, in his last
Uh,
fight. That's where he won the title.
uh, very very interesting.
It went the distance. He beat Bucheka. He's beat a lot of guys.
Okay, but what about did Hamburg lose to Kirill Grashenko? I think Grashenko's the guy I have in mind when I'm trying to mind. I haven't.
Yeah, he lost. That was the one fight he lost.
Was Grashenko undefeated?
I don't know,
Let me
but
look this
he's
up
real.
here.
He's still kind of raw. Really,
See what we
which
got.
is incredible when you're a champion and you're still raw. Kind of like Chimaev. Chimaev is still, he's pretty advanced on the ground. I would say Chimaev's got a good finishing skill, submission skill, um, and he's got a perfect body for it. He's got a long body. You know, those are the guys that are really dangerous on the ground. So Chimaev's pretty advanced on the ground, but he's still, I would say, raw overall. And these guys who can just become championship level fighters that are still kind of raw in some areas.
So Kirill Grashenko beat Rugru, but lost to Uchecha. Heel hooked in a minute. Interesting. I may have to go back and sit and watch some of these fights and get up to speed on all of them. But yeah, no, I think Rugru was one of my must-watch fighters. So for sure, like he's a guy that's definitely interesting and fascinating. And when you go back and you watch some of that fighting in Senegal, it's like that's the real deal. I'd like to actually be young again and go and try to see one of those live because that's got to be just a crazy experience. Let's see here. I think I just got off the page. Todd, am I still with you? Are you still here?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay. Let me go back here because I got off the
He
page and
said
I'm
there's a video where like 20 guys are trying to take down Rugrug, including Paulo Costa, and they couldn't.
yeah, no, I I think you're right. That Senegal wrestling, you know, it's done on sand, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's not, so that's no joke. I know guys that are you know solid professional volleyball players, and when you take volleyball and put it on sand, it's a whole different ballgame. And I imagine that wrestling is even more tiring on sand. You know what I mean? Not to mention, go to the ground or whatever and get scrapped up or whatever. So,
yeah.
so yeah, that's
Your balance has to be, on a completely different level in the sand when you're trying to wrestle in the sand.
very interesting. Yeah, yeah. No, I like that stuff. Like I said, left way. I remember talking to Hume about that guy from Burma, and it's one of the things that they've got a good lock on that market because they know when they put him in the ring that they can count on the entire 30 million population of that country to be watching. It's like I think Hamza was talking here about uh, how all of Senegal pays attention to Rougar's fights. I think that is something that um, one really has a good grasp on in some of those other countries. Keep in mind that at the end of the day, only a small fraction of the American population even watches UFC. So for
I was
sure.
watching him wrestle with a guy on the sand recently, like just a couple days ago, and he grabbed a single leg, and instead of like trying to run the pipe or just trip him down, he trapped it between his legs, and he reached down as far as he could, and he just lifted the guy up over his head with the single. He lifted him all the way up over his head and just threw him into the sand. Like he
Yeah,
was
those
nothing. Just
they do some real interesting rugged fighting in the mountains of Peru as well. I think it's probably maybe more I don't know if culturally they're going to be on the level of these guys. The thing about Rugru on top of it, and the guys in Senegal on top of everything else, is not just bar fighting. It's guys that are really incredible athletes. And the fighting in Peru um, might qualify more as a little bit of rude bar fighting, but what makes it intriguing is that these guys are fighting at 10,000 feet in the mountains. Um, so if any of those guys were to show skill or have skill, they're going to be dangerous. I thought that might be the Mexican kid that fought Rotang's chance, and that was the little pep talk I gave him. I was like, "Look, Rotang is from Thailand, where there's not a lot of height, you know, or you don't fight at altitude, and Mexico City is at altitude, high altitude, and their fight was in Denver. So I was like, get him into the third round, and you might have a chance. He didn't get him to the third round, but for sure, altitude's a big factor. I mean, if you look at it in history, I don't think, knowing both guys personally, I didn't think that um, Fabrizio Verdun had a chance with Cain Velasquez. But Verdun was smart, and Verdun is Brazilian, but he speaks very good Spanish, and he went and spent 6 weeks in Mexico City. And at the end of the day, Mexico City's got more altitude than Denver. Than Denver's called the Mile High City, and Cain was known for his gas, and Cain gassed in that fight. So that's there's still some fighting and stuff that that might be untapped out there. I think Iran is an interesting place. The only problem with Iran to me is we've seen a couple of guys from there, and they, remember Brian Johnson smashing Nasri, I think his name was, who was supposedly an Olympic level wrestler and stuff like that. So I do think you have to have uh, some understanding of what combat is as opposed to competition. I think Rugru has that. I think Rugru is a guy I want by my side in the ditch in World War II.
Yeah, it's crazy that we're talking about him as maybe the best heavyweight in MMA, and he's not a guy that UFC was on their radar probably. And that's where you got to give Chachi credit, that he would look at someone like that.
Yeah. Now I wonder at some point. Yeah, Chowdhury and Hume, I think, are a good two-headed monster. Of like, I think with Hume at his side, and Hume giving him advice, like I said, you've got one of the superior minds in the sport. Um, yeah, yeah, and that's where Dana likes to say he's Dana's not even close to those guys, like to Hume on knowledge, and he may be more blusterful, maybe has more but in terms of like talent assessment and talent,
Oh
like
yeah, for
I
sure, for sure. Yep.
so yeah, and Hume's got that. I got to match make Hume's last MMA fight, and Hume could be a mean man too. You know what I mean? So he's a nice guy, and he's a marketable guy, and he's good on the microphone and smart and everything. But he can be a mean, 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 mean man.
I don't
And
even think the UFC necessarily cares about talent assessment. They'll get some good fighters if they land in their lap or they come across them, but they're not out there scouring the world for guys anymore.
no, I don't think that. I think you're absolutely right. But I think that if you ask Dana, Dana will say, naturally, I'm the best talent assessor in the world. I've heard him talk about how people don't know anything about the sport, that he's the only expert. He calls the shots and stuff. And yeah, that's what it's become. But, you know, Uh, he's he's not a talent assessment person. They had Joe Silva there in the early days. I think Silva hung on and stayed there because he did know what he was talking about in the fight game. And Dana looks for other things. So
Well, I know we've kind of gone long here. We appreciate, it's kind of 2 hours. It's pretty good. I
yeah,
think
yeah.
it's a good time. Um,
No, thank you guys for joining us. I've
time
enjoyed the
and
conversation with David Nags was on here, Super Shotgun joined on, and obviously opened up a whole bunch of great discussions. And Hamza is uh, a warrior. He has not let up for a second.
yeah,
So
just let more guys know about it. Share it with some other hardcores. Um, wherever you hang out on the internet, share it there. Get some more
yeah,
guys in. We can build the community. And yeah, we definitely appreciate everybody checking out the live. And we're going to try to do stuff like this every Thursday. Maybe we'll bring some guys on to ask questions too sometimes,
and
depending on the.
Next Thursday, we can maybe all check in if everybody wants. We'll give you guys a homework assignment. Uh, I'll try to as well. Obviously, is let's try to watch Sakuraba's kid fight, and then we can start the conversation there.
Yeah, yeah, I'm definitely going to check it out.
Well, thanks, guys. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. And really, thank you for the attention. Listening. I'm getting to be an old man, and sometimes just likes to talk too much. So I